Welcome to Human Monsters. This episode, we explore cases involving Russian murderers. What is it that makes these killers so much worse than most of the serial killers from North America? Is it the long, bleak winters? Is there something in the vodka? Did Stalin's tortures drive every survivor crazy? Who knows? But the following specimens certainly did nothing to mend the damage Russia incurred to its international image. Preface. Due to my limited familiarity with the Russian language, it is inevitable that I will mispronounce names of places and people. No offense is intended. Part 1. Nikolai Metal Fang does Huma Galiv. It was 1980, and the Summer Olympics were underway in Moscow. The United States boycotted the event due to Cold War political tensions. That boycott just might have saved some American lives, for there was a bloodbath going on in the streets of a town called Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan, and the tides could very well have swept up on the shores of Moscow. The Russian media, which was state-controlled at the time, insisted that there could be no serial killer because no such phenomena could occur in Russia. They characterized it as something that happened within decadent Western societies like the United States. Granted, most of the serial killers who were getting ink at that time were American, but that didn't mean that such behavior was unheard of in other parts of the world. The government's efforts to insult the public's intelligence notwithstanding, the people of Alma-Ata knew full well that a murderer was on the loose and apparently killing for sport, or at least one could make that assumption about them before an arrest could be made. Only a serial killer would murder 6 people and discard parts of their bodies along a riverbank. Once murdered, the killer would yank entrails out from the torso. They would be decapitated. Chunks of flesh would be carved out of buttocks and thighs. According to pathologists, the slaughter appeared to have been done at another location and brought to the riverbed, for there was little evidence of the presence of blood. If they had been killed and torn apart at the scene, large volumes of blood would have seeped into the ground, and there would have been small traces of flesh and bone in the soil. The murderer dispensed with his victims like they were Christmas trees on New Year's Day. In America, the community would have been gripped by a mass panic. The telephones at the police station would have been ringing off the hook 24/7. The detectives would have been accused of doing nothing while working 24-hour shifts. The police department in Alma-Ata were lackadaisical about tracking down the killer. The reason? The victims were prostitutes. They were hated by mainstream Alma-Ata society and especially by its government. Most civilians, officials in government, and law enforcement were in agreement. Any woman who involves herself in the sex trade risks her life while doing so, and nobody should be surprised if that life is exterminated. Such is one of the hardships of being a sex worker. Most of them grew up poor, many were sexually abused as children, many among them were teenagers and developed substance abuse issues along the way. They were and are considered to be society's garbage and undeserving of protection, and their profession is not perceived as meriting legalization and regulation. If a serial killer wants to get a woman alone so he can kill her, a prostitute is his best bet. As long as your country refuses to legalize prostitution, it is committing murder by default. The only thing that concerned the government was keeping the morbid details quiet so that the country's image would not be tainted. The police would not have had to look far to find the perpetrator. Nikolai Galiv served time in prison for manslaughter before he relocated to Alma-Ata in the late 1970s. Hello, red flag. He worked as an unskilled laborer and befriended some people he deemed worthy of living out the rest of their lives. He didn't come across as creepy, which is usually said as a follow-up to, "I didn't see it coming." Sure enough, he was neatly dressed and carried himself with dignity. He had some false teeth, which were made of metal, hence the moniker, the Fang. He was generally introverted, but nevertheless relished all opportunities to entertain. When he had people for dinner, he delighted in every occasion to show off his skills in the kitchen. He specialized in meat courses that were mostly known as regional specialties, with their origins in Kazakhstan. Among his popular dishes with guests was a pork-filled pasta course. These occasions were elaborate dinner parties, and nobody ever stopped to ask themselves how he could afford the high-end meats and other ingredients that one would normally find behind the scenes at a high-end restaurant. This was especially relevant in Alma-Ata, which was locked in economic depression. Under those circumstances, most people could only afford meat once a week. Meanwhile, Nikolai was practically running his own deli, serving up sausages, cutlets, and meatballs. Normally, someone among the ranks of the highest echelons of political power would dine at such a standard. However, classifying the ingredients on a species-specific metric, it wouldn't be considered suitable as a meal for a vagrant. December 1980. A seventh corpse was found. She was deposited by the same river, as always. 2 days later, Nikolai invited 2 of his drinking buddies to his home for a few drinks and a meal. At one point, Nikolai stood and announced it was time for him to begin preparing the meal. He said he also needed to feed the wood-burning fire. One of his friends stood, offering to help. Nikolai sat him back down and surgically grafted a glass of vodka in his hand. That part was an exaggeration, but he did go back to do the prep work for dinner. While Nikolai was out back gathering his culinary resources, one of the other friends drank all the beer he was given, so he got up and headed to the refrigerator to refresh his glass. Now, envision yourself looking out from a refrigerator, a perspective called a POV, or point of view shot in film and television. In this situation, you look out and you see Nikolai's friend shocked and mortified. What caused such a reaction? A woman's head. The head was on a platter, as if ready for a storefront window display. There was also a plate of bluish-grayish intestines. The man was so upset and mortified, he stepped back in haste, knocking a set of utensils to the floor. Needless to say, the occasion did not proceed as intended. Nikolai's friend dragged him to the police station, most likely due to his fear of being refrigerated piecemeal. Nikolai did not resist arrest or prosecution. You didn't need to be Columbo to figure out he was guilty of murder and cannibalism. Commenting on his homicidal pursuits, he said, "I had always loved to hunt and often went hunting, but this was my first time hunting a woman. I felt my heart pound within me as I ran after her. Hearing my footsteps, she turned around but I caught up with her and put my arm around her neck, dragged her to the side of the landfill. She resisted, and then I cut her throat with a knife. Then I drank her blood. I warmed my hands on the woman's body and stripped her naked. I cut the corpse's breast into strips, removed the ovaries, separated the pelvis and hips. I then folded these pieces into a backpack and carried them home. I melted the fat to fry with, and some parts I pickled. Once I put the parts through a meat grinder and made dumplings. I grilled the heart and the kidneys, grilled the meat too. The meat of this woman took me a month to eat. He said he wanted to purge the world of so-called immoral women. By immoral, he included blonde hair and such inclinations as profanity, alcohol intake, and premarital sex. He was charged with 7 counts of murder, though off the record he confessed to between 50 and 100 homicides. No evidence was found to substantiate that claim, however. He was found to be insane and was committed to a psychiatric hospital in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. 1989. Nikolai managed to escape during a transfer to another institution and remained at large until 1991, when he was recaptured in Fergana, Uzbekistan. He claimed that between his escape and recapture, he killed 2 women every week. This was never proven, apparently just wishful thinking. Crime statistics gathered by the government do not support his braggadocio. Nikolai Metalfang dus Huma Galiv was released in 2011. His present whereabouts are unknown. Part 2. Valerie Azaratan. Valerie Josgevich Azaratan was born in 1958 in Yerevan, Armenian SSR, Soviet Union. There were no signs in his childhood domestic environment indicating that he would grow up to be a monster. His family was loving and supportive. He was an intelligent and quick-witted child, which was notable by the casual observer. Indeed, compared to most children his age, he was a few steps ahead. His perspective on sexuality was similar, in that his awakening would have been considered atypical in its premature emergence. He would convince girls to play doctor with him, an innocent game when played by most children. However, considering that he was doing this before his 5th birthday differentiates it from the typical protocol. He would persuade the girl to remove all her clothes in a location that offered more privacy so he could examine her. The school became aware of this practice, and after several incidents, they reported it to his parents. They were unconcerned, chalking it up to normal childhood curiosity. As Valerie aged toward adolescence, his investigations grew in both rigor and frequency. When he was 13 years old, he lost his virginity to a 15-year-old girl. This only stoked the fire in his loins. He didn't seek out girls of comparable age or older, however. He was more partial to 10-year-olds. His gratification was especially fixated on oral sex, which he forced his victims to perform on him. His parents were unaware of his pedophilia. They were more focused on what they expected to be a bright future, as he indicated he wished to study to become a psychologist. His major was to be preschool psychology. His minor would be pedagogy. While he was away at university, Valerie had a number of sexual encounters with females in his age group, but he continued to fantasize about girls between the ages of 10 and 14. He fueled these visions by reading the novel Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, a story about a professor who has an affair with a 12-year-old girl after dreaming of such relations for decades. Valerie identified with the story's protagonist, Humbert, and aligned with his belief that a man should be legally permitted to seduce underage girls. Following graduation, he began to volunteer at a school for children with special needs. There were girls with severe cerebral palsy among the student body. Those girls became the target of his predation. There were no reports made to the authorities about what he was up to, but he was ejected from this institution after a year without facing legal retribution. Valerie got married to his college girlfriend, and they soon moved to Moscow. With his marriage as a cloak of respectability, he would prey upon underage girls, and he expected the large urban population to provide him with the ability to hide in plain sight. It did not turn out this way. He was discovered sexually abusing a small girl in 1982, and he was incarcerated for 2 years. A year after his release, he was arrested for the sexual abuse of a minor. He was sentenced to 2 years once again. His first wife believed him when he professed his innocence the first time, but this time she left him. After his next release, he found a woman named Marina Agayeva. He was especially pleased that part of the package included her 14-year-old daughter. She knew about his pedophilia, and it didn't concern her. He seduced her before long, along with her daughter. Now he was having sex with both his wife and her daughter, but this arrangement was not enough to satisfy him. He enlisted his wife and her daughter to lure other girls into the fold. Once they were there, he would give them the entire Cosby package, a beverage laced with a sedative, and he would rape them while they were unconscious. The difference is he would record it on video. His wife and stepdaughter believed he was an adult filmmaker preparing his videos for the black market. Speaking of which, one day someone told him that he resembled the widely known Russian director Sviatoslav Shapligin. He capitalized on this data by having a fake ID card made bearing Shapligin's name. He would approach young women on the street and tell them he was shooting a new movie and they would be right for a part. Having agreed to an audition at his home, which he told them was a set for the movie, he would serve the Cosby cocktail and the date rape would commence. The rape would go on for hours, days, or even weeks, and always recorded for posterity. Once he had his fill of a girl, he would drop her off semi-conscious somewhere in public. The police received word from the victims that they suspected they had been drugged and raped. One day, Valerie was visited by the police. They told him about the rapist's presence in the neighborhood. Valerie feigned like he was disgusted by the offender's actions and vowed to report anything he might learn. Once the officers departed, he realized that releasing his victims was putting him at risk of prosecution. He vowed to himself that setting them free would not be part of the agenda in the future. He decided that not only would he kill them, but he would employ a different method for each victim so that the police might be thrown off his trail by assuming that multiple offenders were culpable. The first girl to be murdered was lured to his home with the promise of movie stardom. He administered an overdose of his drug and raped her unconscious body for 2 days. He became bored with her and forced pills down her throat. The lethal amount of drugs killed her, and he took her to a train station where he left her on a bench. The second girl he killed was drowned in his bathtub while she was still unconscious. She was left in a river. The third girl to be murdered by Valerie was stabbed to death and left in an alley. There was no media blitz announcing the murders, so he felt he had done an effective job at covering his tracks. One thing he didn't expect was that one of his living victims began to experience flashbacks. She remembered him introducing himself as a famous movie director in front of a store called Children's World. Police carried out a surveillance operation in front of Children's World in hopes that the so-called director would approach young women. A man soon appeared and approached several girls, though none of them agreed to accompany him home. They followed him home and discovered that the man was taking the same route described by the victim. They ran a check on the man and soon beheld the criminal record of Valerie Azaratan. Nevertheless, they would need to catch him in the act of committing the offense. They got a young and attractive female police officer to loiter about the store. It wasn't long before Valerie Azaratan approached her and gave her the routine about being a movie director and offering her a part in his movie if she were to accompany him to his home. Valerie Azaratan was charged with 10 counts of rape. When police found footage of the 3 murders in his home, he caught 3 homicide charges. June 18, 1992. Valerie Azaratan was found guilty of all charges and was sentenced to death. He was executed by a gunshot to the head. Part 3. Anatoli the Terminator Prieno. Anatoli Prieno was born in Zhytomyrskaya, Ukraine, on July 25, 1959. His mother died when he was a year old, and his father, unprepared for single fatherhood, placed him in the care of relatives, with whom he stayed for the subsequent 3 years. When he was 4 years old, they found childcare to be more of a burden than they could handle, and they placed him in an orphanage. Anatoli never forgot this abandonment, and he would develop an enduring and profound hatred of families. Anatoli left the orphanage at the age of 17, whereupon he enlisted in the Navy. When Anatoli was discharged from the Navy, he enrolled in a university to study forestry. During his time of study, he was evaluated by a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with schizophrenia. Aside from this, his conduct was considered normal by outsiders. Anatoli's life and behavior changed markedly in 1989. He was 30 years old when he killed for the first time. He and his friend Sergei Rogozin became partners in crime. They broke into houses together. Typically, the residents were sleeping when they broke in. During one invasion, they woke the occupants. Rather than risk arrest, the 2 men shot the married couple before slaughtering their 6 children. The 2 men decided to dissolve their partnership and lay low for a while. During the months since the robbery, Prieno replayed the incident in his mind countless times, and the more he thought about it, the more excited he became. He was exhilarated by the kind of carnage he could wreak. Unable to put the idea on ice any longer, Prieno took to the streets in search of victims. He found a family sleeping in a van, an 11-year-old boy among them. He woke them all and herded them out of the van. He had them all standing next to each other. He shot every single one of them in single file. Once they were all dead, he incinerated the bodies. You can't murder entire families without attracting attention. So Prieno decided the best move at that time would be to leave Ukraine. He traveled throughout Europe, making a living as an unskilled laborer and through petty theft. He committed no murders at that time. Prieno returned to Ukraine after his 5 years of migration and was ready to get his hands dirty once again. December 12, 1995, Garmarnya, Ukraine. Prieno broke into the home of a university lecturer named Zaichenko. He killed the man, his wife, and their 2 infant sons. December 31st, 1995, Prieno broke into the home of the Krienchukov family, whereupon he murdered all 4 residents and set their house on fire. He shot a pedestrian who supposedly had been a witness to the crime. January 5th, 1996, 2 businessmen by the names of Odintsov and Dolinin were sitting in a car talking when Prieno shot them both. That same night, he shot a pedestrian in the village of Vasilyevka Dnepropetrovsk. He then proceeded to shoot a police officer who showed up to investigate the gunshots. The next day, he approached 3 men who were examining a car that had broken down next to a highway. He left their corpses on the tarmac. January 17th, Prieno returned to the village of Bratkovich. He broke into the Pilot family home and shot them all to death. He set fire to the house. When 2 neighbors investigated to see if they could help, he shot them too. January 30th, 4 more people would meet their ends at Prieno's hands, including a 28-year-old nurse and her 2 sons. February 19th, the Dubchuk family was murdered by Prieno in their home. The father and son were shot in the backs of their heads. The mother and daughter were bludgeoned to death with a hammer. February 27th, Prieno killed 4 members of the Bodnarchuk family in Malina. He shot the parents and hacked the children to pieces with an axe. He still wasn't satisfied, so he broke into the next house over, where he murdered the homeowner and cut them up with a large kitchen knife. March 22nd, Prieno was in Bratkovich. There he killed 4 members of the Novosad family. He set their house on fire. The authorities detected patterns in the murderer's modus operandi. The fires, vicious murders, not just of adults, but also of children and babies. There were often family photos on the floor. There was something personal about it. April 7th, 1996. A police officer by the name of Igor Kunyi received a strange phone call around noon. It was a man named Pyotr Prieno, and he called to say he was an officer living at the Bratkovich military base. He said a cousin of his named Anatoli had been staying with him and his family for weeks, and they had grown tired of his presence. He was apprehensive about asking Anatoli to leave, but then he found a cache of weapons under his bed, whereupon he asked him to make himself scarce. He became fearful for his family's safety when Anatoli shouted, "You'll pay by Easter." One of Anatoli's guns was the exact model used to kill people that the serial killer was murdering. Prieno was soon arrested. After a thorough search, police found stolen items that had belonged to Prieno's victims, as identified by serial numbers. Prieno confessed to the general of the Ukrainian police. He admitted to committing 52 murders, which he said he carried out as instructed by a force from, quote, another world. He also said he had special hypnotic powers. He declared himself the, quote, best killer in the world. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison and died of a heart attack while incarcerated. Part 4. Viktor Sayenko and Igor Soproniuk. The friendship of Viktor Sayenko and Igor Soproniuk began when they were in grade 3. There was some common ground in that they were born into wealthy and socially well-connected families. Igor's father was considered one of the country's premier pilots and even flew planes for the president. Viktor's father was a lawyer. It's hard to imagine that two kids who came from such privilege would conduct themselves within such moral squalor. What is known is that they brought out the worst in each other. Their first mutual brush with the law happened when they were in grade 5. They were fond of throwing rocks at passing trains. They were caught and let off with a warning due to Viktor's father's connections in the legal system. Having gotten away with that, their juvenile criminal careers continued. They tortured animals by the time they were in the 8th grade, a widely documented early indicator of violent and homicidal behavior among serial killers. They recorded much of those acts on video. Feeling they were impervious to retribution and prosecution, one day when Viktor was 17 years old, he beat up a boy in broad daylight and stole his bicycle. There were several witnesses to the act, but he didn't care. He was charged, but his father had the charges dropped, so Viktor didn't learn a thing. The boys didn't do well in high school since they convinced each other there was no value in scholastic achievement. After graduating, they started menial jobs. Viktor became a security guard while Igor's father bought him a taxi. Viktor supplemented his income by beating up and robbing some of his passengers. June 25th, 2007. This would be a date remembered in infamy in regard to Igor and Viktor. They were canvassing the streets in search of a victim. They weren't looking to steal a bike this time. They found one in 33-year-old Ekaterina Ilchenko, who was heading home after visiting a friend. Igor, hammer in hand, attacked her. He landed a blow on the side of her head, hard enough that she collapsed to the ground. He stood astride her and rained down one strike after another upon her. When he was finished, he and Viktor broke into laughter and walked away. Ekaterina's face was damaged to the point that it was a mishmash of blood, brain matter, and splinters of bone. Only partially satisfied by that assault, the boys targeted a homeless man named Roman Tatarovich, who was sleeping on a bench across the street from the public prosecutor's office, of all places. They beat him to death before he was roused awake. He was so brutally assaulted, his facial features were unrecognizable. 6 days later, the boys went to the town of Novomoskovsk. On that occasion, they killed 2 people, Evgenia Grishenko and Nikolai Sershuk. They were both bludgeoned to death. 5 days later, the boys were prowling the streets of their hometown when they happened upon Egor Nezhvoloda, who was intoxicated after an evening at a nightclub. The boys swooped down and battered the man, knocking him to the ground. They beat and kicked him to death. Incredibly, Nezhvoloda was just the first of 3 people they slaughtered that evening. 28-year-old Elena Schramm was assaulted and bludgeoned to death during her shift working as a security guard. A similar fate befell mother of 3, Valentina Hansa, hours later. The media began to report on all these acts of senseless, brutal violence carried out by the so-called Dnepropetrovsk maniacs. The exposure did not put an end to the boys' antics. In the village of Podgorgodnoi, they happened upon 2 14-year-old boys who were on their way to a fishing hole. They attacked them both, killing Andrei Sidyuk. The other boy, Vadim Lyatyakov, managed to escape and provide a description of the boys to the police. In the meantime, the killing spree continued. On July 12th, 48-year-old Sergei Yatsenko went missing while riding his motorcycle near Dnepropetrovsk. His corpse was found 4 days later. It was a struggle to ascertain his identity, with his remains left so torn and tattered. Homicide had become an addiction for these boys, for they committed 13 more murders over the span of 4 days. They didn't appear to have a preference for victim demographics. They would kill men, women, children, the elderly, the homeless, drunks, and drug addicts at random. It appeared that their only requirement was that the person was still alive. The attacks were captured on video and escalated in maliciously sadistic hostility. Mutilation was common. Murders were prolonged to ensure their victims endured excruciating tortures. Eyes were gouged out while the victim was still alive. A pregnant woman's fetus was torn from her womb. The boys robbed all their victims of whatever cash and valuables they had on their person. Once Igor brought a cell phone to a pawn shop to sell. The pawnbroker told him he would need to activate the phone to prove it still worked. Igor agreed to do this. What he didn't know was that the police were monitoring the phone. Once it was activated, they traced its location, and Igor was arrested at the pawn shop. It wasn't long before Igor gave up Victor. Both boys confessed to the crimes during questioning, though Igor later recanted his statements. Victor would eventually plead guilty to the charges in hopes that such an action would net him a lesser sentence. Igor challenged the prosecutor to prove who dealt the death blows. February 11th, 2009. Both boys were found guilty of multiple counts of murder. They were sentenced to life in prison. Part 5. Alexander Rambo Bishkov. The story of Alexander Bishkov's life is somewhat reminiscent of that of the character Norman Bates in Psycho. He was a coward who was raised by his mother and even feared her as an adult. She would always prevail upon him, and he was taciturn and easily henpecked into submission by her. With one harsh word, she would have him begging for clemency and forgiveness. Whether he was right or wrong mattered not. His girlfriend was put off by it. His girlfriend, Svetlana, told him to stop being a doormat. She warned him, "Either man up or lose me forever. I need a real man, not a puppy dog." He was terrified of losing Svetlana. She was his first girlfriend, and he considered her well worth keeping with her good looks and vivacious temperament. He did his utmost to stand up for himself in a row with his mother, but she won as always. He was humiliated, as usual. Svetlana couldn't take it anymore. She told him not to contact her again until he grew up. Alexander was devastated. He sank into a deep depression. He did little but cocoon himself in his home, watching television, especially true crime programming. He kept a diary and wrote extensively about how cruel the world is and how much he resented the treatment he had received throughout his life. One day, a show aired on television that changed Alexander's life forever. It was a documentary about the Siberian murderer Alexander Spetsivov. At one time, he had been a respected public intellectual, but he became notorious for murdering and cannibalizing a dozen street children. Alexander was very impressed. There appeared to be few differences between the two men, aside from their given names. Both had medium-build physiques. They looked harmless, but were both capable of striking fear in the hearts of the entire community with their actions. Among Spetsivov's victims were the homeless, which Bishkov couldn't stand as he walked the streets of Belinsky, his hometown. That day, Alexander wrote in his diary, "She said I was a wimp, not a wolf. I will show her. Maybe she will stop complaining and understand that I am a lone wolf." Initially, Bishkov was unsure if he could commit murder. He was unsure of himself in general, with his lack of confidence and failure to assert himself. He did his homework. This consisted of reading every book about serial killers he could get his hands on. He focused particularly on how the killers stalked their victims, their killing techniques, and how they managed to avoid capture. September 2009. One night, Alexander Bishkov drank a few shots of vodka to loosen himself up, and he took to the streets. He was armed with a large kitchen knife and a claw hammer. Throughout the subsequent 2.5 years, police received regular reports about homeless people disappearing from the streets. Because of their low status in society, which was also true of the people who reported the disappearances, the authorities invested little time in solving the cases. They often assumed that because of the nomadic nature of their lives, they'd simply migrated to another town. January 12th, 2012. A young man clad in a black hoodie and a black overcoat committed a smash and grab boldly in the middle of town square in the middle of the day. The perpetrator broke the window of a hardware store and grabbed several items, mostly kitchen knives. He was soon arrested. In the police station, the culprit was revealed to be one Alexander Bishkov. He was a local with no record. Strangely, as he was questioned about the robbery, he began to lecture the officers about the subjects of murder and cannibalism. At first, the detectives assumed he was drunk. He claimed he'd killed 11 men and that he'd eaten their hearts and livers. He buried 6 of them in his backyard. Officers were dispatched to his home to search for bodies and body parts. The search was not carried out in vain. For one thing, they found his journal, which was practically an affidavit and an admission of his guilt. One thing he wrote in the book was, "The bloody hunt of a predator born in the year of the dragon." He also wrote that he found homeless people repulsive. He described his murder methodology, which involved hitting the victim with a claw hammer to leave them in a daze, whereupon he would stab and slash them with large kitchen knives. He would slice open their abdomen and yank out their heart and liver, which he would eat. Most of the victims were dragged back to his home and buried in the yard. 3 of them were buried in the woods. There was no evidence that he ate their hearts and livers, but he wrote about it, and whether he was mentally ill or not, his sincerity was not called into question. Oh, and he referred to himself as Rambo. March 2013. Alexander Bishkov reported to trial for 9 counts of murder. He was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to life in prison. Part 6. Siri the Pologovsky maniac Tekkash. Siri Tekkash was born in Kiselyovsk, Russia on September 12, 1952. Details about his youth are classified, but it is known that in his early adulthood he was conscripted into the military. He served on the battlefield in Afghanistan and sustained an injury so severe it resulted in a medical discharge. After leaving the military, he joined the police force in Kemerovo, Siberia. There he became an expert on forensics and was promoted to the rank of inspector. He was remembered for being exceptional in his competency. Due to this, his superiors were surprised when he suddenly resigned in 1980. Tekkash moved to Dnepropetrovsk, a city in Ukraine. In the subsequent 25 years, he would live in Crimea, Zaporozhye, and Kharkov. He worked in coal mines and industrial plants. He married 3 times and sired 5 children. It was also during that time that his killing spree took place. The first known victim was an unidentified teenage girl who had been strangled to death in Simferopol, Crimea in 1980. He defiled the corpse. After zipping up, he called the police to report the murder. What he was reporting sounded so outrageous that the first responder he spoke to assumed it was a prank. Nevertheless, police were dispatched to the scene and found the dead girl there. Tekkash removed all traces of DNA to avoid being a suspect. He knew how to do it, after all. He was paid to learn how to do it. For years after his first killing, he murdered girls of various ages, some as young as 8 and some as old as 18. The corpses were always naked and contorted in odd positions. Autopsies always ascertained the victims had been strangled and raped. Typically, Tekkash phoned the murders in himself. Usually the bodies were deposited close to train tracks or a major roadway. It was a very challenging situation for detectives because there were no clues. They knew that whoever was committing these murders knew a thing or two about how to clean up after themselves. He would burn the victim's clothing. He mushed up shoe and tire impressions. Hair, semen, and all other DNA-based evidence was eliminated. He even went as far as to pour some cheap perfume on the ground to throw off the canine unit. However, he did make mistakes. Serial killers often like to bring home keepsakes from their victims. Tekkash would bring home items such as jewelry, tubes of lipstick, cosmetic mirrors, purses, undergarments, and, most damning of all, identity documents. His biggest error was in killing someone he knew. The victim was 9-year-old Katya Marquises, a daughter of one of his friends. He killed her in July 2005 in the city of Zaporozhye. Unbeknownst to Tekkash, some of Katya's friends saw her talking to him on the day of her disappearance. They described him to police, though they contradicted each other and were often vague with certain details. He was brazen enough to attend her funeral. One of the girls who spotted him talking to Katya when she disappeared ran to her mother in tears and told her Tekkash was the man she saw. Her mother contacted police, and he was taken into custody at the funeral home. When the police arrested him, he said, "What took you so long?" The police didn't have to twist his arm to get a confession. He happily gave up the gory details. He said his motive was to embarrass the police force by proving how incompetent they were. He said he targeted little girls because he wanted vengeance after having been mistreated by the women in his life. He reported having killed a minimum of 100 victims. The detectives were skeptical, but Tekkash listed details about each incident and victim, and his credibility was upheld. Siri Tekkash was convicted on 29 counts of murder and 11 counts of attempted murder. This outcome was not to his liking, evidenced by his frustration with the court. He felt they understated his achievement. He insisted upon receiving a death sentence, but Ukraine abolished the death penalty. He was given a life sentence. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.